Breaking down Toronto's 2026 budget, what it means for residents and city services. Today, we're taking a closer look at Toronto's 2026 budget and what it means for residents. On January 12th, in a virtual open session organized by Progress Toronto's Councillor Bravo's Chief of Staff, Wyndham Bettencourt-McCarthy, joined by Budget Committee Vice Chair Councillor Gord explained how the city plans to fund services, transit, housing, and more. With an operating budget of $18.9 billion and a 10-year capital plan of $63.1 billion, Toronto faces tough choices. Residents heard how the city balances rising costs, aging infrastructure, and limited revenue tools, all while maintaining essential services and addressing affordability challenges. The budget may be complex, but understanding it is essential. Today's session is part of making the process accessible so that residents can see how decisions are made and have a voice in shaping the city's future. And now, let's join the virtual session courtesy of Progress Toronto, where the city's 2026 budget is explained and community questions are answered.
On the right, you can see that the operating budget for this year, for 2026, is $18.9 billion. The capital budget is $63.1 billion, but again, that is a 10-year period that the capital budget is looking at, rather than a one-year period like the operating budget. One of the things that the city does when they present their budget, the city staff do, is they talk about this opening budget pressure. And so because the city has to present a balanced budget, when the city divisions start working to put the budget together, there's a gap usually between how much the things that we need to deliver cost and how much revenue we're bringing in through sources like a property tax. So several years ago, especially coming out of the pandemic, it was realized by city staff and city leaders that the city had a real budget shortfall issue. A big part of that was because of the ongoing impacts of COVID that continued to impact city services even after any funding from the federal government for COVID relief was long gone. So these impacts continued into 2023 and 2024. That really led to growing of this budget shortfall. So in 2024, it was flagged that the budget shortfall at the start of the year was a big hole of $1.8 billion. In 2025, when they redid that exercise to try to see how big that hole was, it had shrunk due to a number of efforts to increase revenue and to increase efficiencies and cut certain costs to $1.2 billion. This year, the opening budget pressure, that gap between what we spend and what we need to bring in, was $1.07 billion. So it's gone down quite a lot, essentially halved in 2 years, which is great, but still a pretty big challenge for the city divisions to figure out, okay, we have this gap, this hole of $1 billion. How are we going to fill this? And a big part, I'll just say briefly, a big part of getting that hole cut in half, in addition to a lot of efforts by this administration and by city staff, was that a new deal with the province was negotiated in 2023. That was a 3-year agreement, which meant that not only would the city be able to upload all the repair work for the Gardiner Expressway and for the highways, but also that we would get a significant amount of operating funding each year from the provincial government for transit and our shelter system. And so because that deal was negotiated through Mayor Chow and Premier Ford, that brought in money that was able to really reduce this opening gap pressure from what you see here in 2024 to 2026. So some of you might be wondering, why does Toronto have this kind of budget hole each year? In addition to those sort of unique measures that I mentioned, like COVID, Toronto also just has a lot of challenges by nature of the fact of many of the things that Councillor Kurtz talked about. We have a really limited ability to generate revenue. The City of Toronto and municipalities are only allowed to generate revenue through primarily property-related taxes and sources. So that's why we have property tax. That's why we have a land transfer tax, a hotel tax. But cities are not allowed to pursue other revenue sources, at least in Canada, the way they are in some cities in the United States, like a sales tax, like New York City has. Other cities around the world sometimes get a share of income tax revenue. The city of Toronto doesn't have the ability to get revenue from any of those sources because we are not allowed to do it in legislation. So that presents a particular challenge that we only really have this one place to draw our tax revenue from. And the image on the right just sort of shows this, that of all the taxes that the average person pays, whether they're paying, sales tax when they're buying something, they're paying income tax when they're paying, their taxes on their wages, they're paying taxes at all these different points. For each dollar of tax that a person spends, municipal governments get about 9 cents of that. The rest of it is going to provincial and federal coffers. So that means that municipalities have a much smaller ability to spend than the provincial and federal levels. So some of the challenges for this year's budget was that the city had kind of flagged were that same issue with our revenue tools, that they're attached to property, so they don't grow with the economy the same way that like a sales tax or income tax does. At the same time, there's significant inflation and cost increases. So we're seeing this everywhere. I mean, we're seeing it at the grocery store, we're seeing it at restaurants, but it also means that all the services the city provides and pays people to provide and buys materials to provide, the costs of those have gone up significantly. So it's more expensive in terms of materials you're buying, supplies you're buying, and labor that you're using to deliver services. And then we also have significant pressures from operating the country's largest shelter system as well as the country's largest transit system. Those are unique Toronto challenges that are expensive on our budget side. And capital challenges, we have a growing state of good repair challenge, which I'll talk about a little bit more, as well as trying to balance a lot of different capital priorities between building new infrastructure that we really need and fixing what we have, which in many cases may have been built, 40, 50 years ago and needs to be get up. So I'm not going to spend much time here because I think I've already said all this, but just that a key focus of this year's budget was affordability while maintaining services. The property tax increase for this year, a lot of times when it's reported in the media, the figure 2.2% is usually used. That is a figure that's composed of a few different pieces that I'll speak more about towards the end of the presentation. But it's both a 0.0% increase in the property tax rate combined with something called the city building levy, which supports the city building fund, which is a 1.5% increase. That's a levy that goes specifically to fund transit and housing infrastructure. And this is so added that 0.7% plus 1.5%, you get the 2.2%. That is usually reported as the increase for this. So here's our total operating budget. So that's, again, the day-to-day services that are going to be provided throughout 2026 for the year. On the left here, you can see there's the property tax supported operating budget is in dark blue. And then in lighter blue, there's the rate supported operating budget. So that rate supported operating budget, that 12%, that's for those three programs I mentioned, solid waste, Toronto Water, and Toronto Parking. And so those are just kind of hived off because they're the rate payer programs. They're paid by usage rather than coming out of the general property tax revenue base. On the right here, you can see how the budget has changed. The operating budget has changed from 2025. It's gone up by about 1.1% spending. And the key drivers here show what is driving those increases. So an increase in emergency services, that's primarily labor costs for staffing, for long-term staff plans for paramedics, fire, and police. Transit, you can see there's an increase that is partially due to the TTC taking over the new lines 5 and line 6 from the provincial transit agency Metrolinx. So operating those lines is coming onto the city's books because of the TTC. And then in this dark blue, you'll see that there's actually a reduction, loss of 276 million. That's actually less financial and provincial funding that the city is getting this year compared to previous years. So that's also putting a pressure on the operating budget as we're getting less money than we have relied on in the past. So this is a fun graph that is always included in the city's budget presentation. On the left, that red column is the budget operating pressure or gap that we talk about, that the city has to figure out how to fill each year when they start looking at what they want to spend versus what they want to bring in. And you'll see here it's really tall. It's $1.34 billion was the original operating pressure. And a lot of times, it's assumed the city will just fix that by raising property tax. But that little tiny green column next to it shows that a 1% increase in property tax only generates about $50 million. So in order to make up this entire gap just through property tax increases, in this single year, if we didn't do anything else, the city would have to increase the property tax by 27%. And so what that kind of shows you is that when they're putting together the budget, the city staff have to explore other avenues as well as property tax increases. They do, of course, evaluate property tax increases and make a recommendation, but they also have to find other ways to address this shortfall because it's just such a big gap. And then you can see to the right how tall some of the other columns are for the depth of the expenditures that we need to spend operating these services per year. So the top one is TTC and Wheel-Trans. That's the most expensive operating kind of line item. Then we have police services, then affordable housing and shelters, then fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just a helpful visual to kind of show how the different buckets stack up against each other in terms of what we spend. So getting back to that $1.34 billion gap, that operating budget pressure, here's just a slide that shows from the city's financial services division, the people who put together the budget, how they managed to fill that, how they managed to present a balanced operating budget this year. You'll see all the way on the right, there's $35 million of that hole is being filled by a property tax increase. The property tax increase is quite low this year, so we are getting a ton of money in from that. But there's all these other buckets that the City Financial Services Division has explored to ensure that the whole is equal. So there's $135 million was found in reductions. That's defined by City Finance as a combination of efficiencies and line-by-line reviews. Some examples are savings from technology improvements, review of consultants and contracted services and streamlining that. There's savings due to reduced fuel costs from switching to EV vehicles and a lot of these cities' fleets, for example, and elimination of underutilized funds. So all of those kind of reviews have helped save $135 million. Next, there's a $653 million savings, which is in offsets. This includes things like slowdown of non-essential staff positions, as well as revenue adjustments. So some of the revenue adjustments that were done came from policy changes. One example is that late in 2025, the city, through a motion by the mayor, I believe, passed a increase to the mansion tax policy. So that means that if you sell a home that's valued at over $3 million in Toronto, you pay an additional amount of tax on it. We, the United City Council, we voted to increase that amount at the end of last year, and so that means more revenue is going to come to city coffers from that change. So that there's changes in revenue key in the federal and provincial governments and to India adjustments mean that they were able to find 653 million in OXOX. The last two categories I won't speak about too much because it's really like deep financial expertise that I do not have at all. But these are financing adjustments and temporary bridging strategies. Yes, maybe at the end we'll have Councillor, do you want to say anything about those now? Okay. Maybe if people have specific questions, maybe Councillor Parks can attempt to answer them at the end. But a lot of it has to do with how the city's capital assets and infrastructure is financed, things like debt financing, adjustments, stuff that's really quite complicated accounting wizardry that I don't fully understand. So, but they were able to do that in order to find some additional funding to free up so that we could have a balanced budget this year. So where does the money come from for our operating budget? Only about a third of it actually comes from property taxes. So you can see here 31% of what we're spending in our operating budget for 2026 is coming from the property tax revenue source. The next largest amount is from the feds of the province. So the province is paying a bit more than the feds. You can see here, the city is very reliant on that funding to deliver many of the services that we deliver. 12% of the operating budget comes from those rate programs, Toronto Water, Solid Waste, Toronto Parking Authority, that people pay the user rates. 9% comes from our reserves. And then other fares and user fees like transit fares, for example, are 6% of the operating budget. So every time you pay when you take the TTC, you're contributing to paying for the city's operating budget to that 6%. Same with if you pay a user fee at a city rec center to use the swimming pool or an exercise class. That is also going into that user fees and fines category. That's helping to pay for the budget. The land transfer tax, which is a tax that's collected when people sell property, when property transfers over, that's at about 5% of the cost of delivering our operating budget. So here's just another way of looking at where the money goes. We saw a little bit of where the money goes in that previous chart with the columns. This is another way of sort of thinking about how the money out of our operating budget is allocated. And so you'll see the largest amount here, 26%, goes to cost-shared programs. That means those programs that the city delivers with funding also from the federal and provincial government. It's everything from shelters, affordable housing, childcare, long-term care, Toronto community housing, public health, employment programs. All of those come under the cost-shared social programs umbrella. So when you lump them all together, that is one of the biggest chunks that the city is providing in this operating budget. However, you'll see that there's this net part and the revenue part. And under cost-shared social programs, the Doug Brew revenue part is quite big because while the city is delivering all these services, we are getting money from the federal province to deliver. So that's the important kind of distinction. The next one on transit, you'll see it's a little bit more balanced. The city is putting in almost as much as the support that we're getting from the revenue, whether that's from support from other levels of government, or in this case with transit, the revenue is often from people just paying their fares and riding with transit systems. The rate programs, you'll see here, that's all dark blue because it's all revenue. It's sort of cost neutral. We're collecting fees on those programs, collecting rates on those programs, and then paying for the service delivery. And then you'll see here all the other buckets: police, governance and corporate services, financing, etc., all the way down. So yeah, that's just a fun way to look at the difference between what the city is spending versus its net expenditure after revenue. Affordability is a key, theme here, as we've spoken about. So freezing TTC fares, launching fare capping, expanding school food and nutrition programs, There's also more money for extended library hours, enhanced community crisis service that operates on the TTC now, increasing a pilot where low-income seniors can get air conditioners, and expanding the When Safe TO rental standard enforcement program. And then there's also more money for traffic agents to adjust congestion and for more emergency service staff. So that includes paramedics, fire, and police. There's also in this budget, usually every year, the city holds back a little chunk of money, which is unallocated. And that means that they have a little kind of pool that they separate off that can be influenced by public deputations and discussed by the mayor and councillors all the way up to that February 10th budget date. So the pool that they've held back this year is $2 million of unallocated funds. And so something to think about when you're thinking about a deputation or contacting a city councillor is what would you like to see that $2 million go towards as, you know, if you have a program or project in mind that could use those resources. And there's usually a fun debate on the budget day, which is February 10th. Some councillors have referred to it as sort of a budget Hunger Games, where councillors sort of duke it out for their preferred vision of what that bucket, that $2 million should go towards. Okay, so quickly, we're going along. It's good. Going to go into capital budget. Again, 10-year plan, $63 billion of investment over that 10 years. A key priority in all capital plans at this point now is addressing what we call SOGR, or state of good repair, simply because Toronto has been a big city for a while now. A ton of the infrastructure that we have is very old. And so as we saw with the Gardner Expressway, which they actually don't have to deal with anymore because of the New Deal, chunks of it were falling down because it was aging. Needed significant investment in repair if it was going to be fixed to operate safely. So addressing the state of good repair takes up about half of the capital budget room, which is sort of an interesting challenge because it means then that there's less money to build shiny new things. So here's that same slide that we saw for the operating budget, but here it is on the capital plan. On the left, you see that same division between what is the tax-based funded capital investment, that's about 68%, and then what is supported by those rate programs, which is about 32%. So again, those same three rate programs, solid waste, Toronto Water, and Toronto Parking Authority, they are paying for 32% of the capital budget because they require significant infrastructure investments as well, specifically Toronto Water. There has to be new sewer systems built and water sanitation treatment and piping and all sorts of things like that. So there's a lot of infrastructure projects that are attached to the delivery of Toronto. And then on the right, you can just see that the cost of our capital plan is growing each year. That makes sense because the cost of delivering the capital plan through materials and labor and inflation has gone up significantly within just years. Here is the part of where how the city spends the capital plan, or where the city invests in the capital plan. We can see that Toronto water infrastructure is the number one. And that's for many of the reasons I mentioned. We need to have a functioning sewer system. We need to have flood protection. We need to have tap water that's safe to drink coming out of every tap. And so that requires a huge infrastructure. The next largest category is transit. That's important for, all the new transit lines that we're trying to invest in, but also replacing much of the aging buses, fleet, subway cars, track lines, signal maintenance, all of that has to come out of transit capital expenditure. Housing is just an interesting one that I'll flag here. You'll see that there's a division between the dark blue and the light blue. So the dark blue is that in our capital plan, we are building actual affordable housing, which was something the city had taken a break from for many years. So it's exciting to see we can get back to it. But there's also a chunk that is incentives are foregone levy. So that means that the city also offers incentives to nonprofits, co-ops, and private housing developers to provide below market housing. And we do that by waiving certain municipal fees and costs. And so in doing that, we're letting some of the revenue that we would normally be collecting go. And so that creates an increased cost, even if we aren't directly given those projects money. Then you'll see here there's other categories, transportation, like roadways, environment and recreation. That includes things like new parks, new pools, community centers, all of that. And then, those can go all the way down. So I'll go through the next slides quickly because I know you want to get to questions. Here is just a summary of the capital investments that the city operates. So we operate the largest public housing system in the country. We also operate 32 shelters that are City of Toronto owned and operated, and then 39 childcare centers. And so in this budget, there are investments for repairs and maintenance to a lot of vital structure, as well as for UC shelters and childcare spaces. Here is just a snapshot of the transit infrastructure. So all the things we own on the left: subways, streetcars, bus garages, sidewalks, traffic control signals, bridges, all sorts of things. And then on the right, you can see a summary of the many things that this capital budget is investing in. So subway upgrades, modernizing bus service, streetcar fleet changes, road maintenance and work, all. So the city capital plan also includes the emergency systems infrastructure that the city owns. So that includes like police stations, police vehicles, ambulance stations, ambulances themselves, fire stations, fire safety equipment, all of that. And then on the right, we'll see what this budget is investing in terms of capital work for those stations, equipment, parts, uniforms, everything that we sort of need to have emergency services up. And then, finally here, we just have community services. So all the things the city owns in terms of our community centers, our skating rinks, our pools, our beaches, tons of public parkland. All of that has to be maintained, serviced. There's lots of wear and tear on many of those assets. So on the right, we'll see the investments that we're making from water infrastructure, stormwater management, 12 new and 9 revitalized community centers, 125 public washroom upgrades in many parts of the city. The only place that, you can find a free public washroom is the city park or city facility. Those washrooms need to regularly be upgraded and winterized. Arena upgrades, ice rink upgrades, all of that tree stuff. Here is just a summary of that state of good repair backlog and the state of good repair investment that we need to make. And really a key element here is that the city is responsible for 60% of public infrastructure, but we only get 9% of tax revenue to maintain that infrastructure. So the city is responsible for providing all these buildings and roads and bridges and built form that we need to have a city, but we have very little money to actually maintain it year over year. And so because of city assets aging, we do have this state of good repair need that this budget is significantly investing in, which is why you see the 53% of the capital plan dedicated to city. Here is just a chart, if anyone is interested in state of good repair specifically, that does show that we decreased our state of good repair backlogs from 2024. It was projected to be $12.4 billion. 2026, it's down to $11.5 billion. It did go up a little bit from last year due to cost increases that I've mentioned. But here just shows that we're sort of trying to steadily make progress on cutting down that backlog of state of care projects. So the last thing I'll talk about before we get to questions, which will be in just a couple minutes, is just the property tax increase, how it breaks down, and what it looks like for an average household. So here you'll see the different classes of tax increases. Multi-residential is for buildings that have 6 units or more. So everything below that is classified as residential. Multi-residential, you'll see the levy is about half of what it is for residential. That's because there's an incentive to try to create more multi-residential, specifically rental housing. So that's part of the reason it's lower. It's about half of the regular homeowner residential. Similarly, commercial is also lower as well. And commercial, there's a small business subclass that provides a further discount on commercial property tax rates to try to support small and independent businesses in this competitive economic environment. So here you see, when I spoke about earlier, we have the operating levy, which is sort of the property tax bump. That's 0.7%. We have the city building levy, which is the dedicated fund that goes to build housing transit infrastructure. That's 1.5%. And that combines to a 2.2% property tax increase. Now, for the average Toronto home, that amounts to about $91 a year increase over what their property tax bill were each. The average Toronto home is assessed by a organization called MPAC, which is a provincial organization that the city does not have control over. But the average value of a Toronto home in 2016 was $690,000. And the MPAC has frozen their rates at 2016 levels. The province hasn't increased the assessment since that period. So that means that homes are generally valued below their worth on the sale market. I would say it's almost about half, usually, of what the home is generally considered worth. That being said, the home's assessment by MPAC, that does include condos. So we aren't just talking about houses. We're talking about condos as well. But yes, the average home value at $690,000 does generally seem low. And that's partially because we've had essentially a 10-year freeze on assessing that value. That is not something that city can change. It can only be changed through provincial directive because it's a provincial organization that assesses property values. There is a relief program for low-income seniors or people who are on disability assistance for property tax relief. And those programs have been in existence in Toronto for a number of years. So there is that kind of relief system for people who feel really squeezed to buy a property tax increase, provided they qualify. This is the city building fund. That's just that 1.5% that I spoke about. Here's a bit more information and clarification on how much revenue it raises. It's really important for investing in our transit and housing infrastructure. And future uses of that revenue include things like the Eglinton East LRT, which hopefully will get built, and the city share of the Waterfront East Rapid Transit. So any of these like big new infrastructure projects through transit and housing really are supported by the city building levy of the 1.5% increase. Here is just a sample property tax bill. Again, that's using that average home person family we're imagining with the property that's assessed value of $692,000. And so here's just the dollar amount that goes to each of these main city chunks based on a property tax bill. So if this was your property tax bill, your home was assessed at this value. Here's how much you would take from your property tax bill to go to transit, police, foster social programs, financing, fire and paramedic services, all of that hits. Here's just a quick comparison of the average property taxes paid per household by Toronto versus a number of other municipalities. If you look at the full budget presentations, there's a few more fun slides comparing different cities. This is just one of them. But it's interesting to see that Toronto here kind of falls right in the middle. So the average household in Toronto is paying more property tax than Vancouver, Calgary, Ottawa, Montreal, but we're paying less than Hamilton, Markham, Vaughan, Mississauga, and Boyapta. So when we compare specifically to other GTA municipalities, Toronto generally does have a property tax rate that is lower than a number of other GTA regions. And here's just the rate increases for those 3 rate programs that I kept talking about. Toronto Water, Solid Waste, Parking Authority. These aren't voted on in the budget. They're actually voted on at the last December meeting of council before the budgets. They were approved in December, so there's nothing left to decide here. They're usually increased at a pretty solid rate of between 3 and 4%. And that's to deliver wastewater, solid waste services, not usually a very controversial area for the pieces of the late payer programs. Here's the budget process, just showing that the work actually began back in the first round of public consultations, which were at a public survey, which is done back in October of 2025, the launch, which we had last week, and then the telephone town halls that are coming up in the next couple days. And then you can see the rest and stats where you begin to vote. And that is it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, Winder. Yeah, give a little round of applause or reaction. Some key takeaways for all of us to be thinking about. Is that Torontonians are feeling more affordability pinch, right? I think we hear that from elected officials, from all of us. We feel it. I went to the grocery store and paid an insane amount of money. And I go to Freshco, and I paid an insane amount of money for a small amount of groceries. We know this. Income, cost of living, income and housing. And the city doesn't have, it has limited resources, right? It doesn't have any inputs of wages, mortgage rent control, or social assistance rates. It also, like Wyndham had said, has a limited tax base, right? But it is very property focused. So there are very few ways the city can actually get money in. And that is why it often is focused on property. And that the city does need partners in the federal and provincial governments rely on campaigns that we were involved with pushing around childcare, around public health and things like that, and also transit investments. We know we need the province to actually fund a lot of the transit stuff that we do. And then, of course, the negotiation of the New Deal between that Mayor Chow and provincial government moving forward had come to in 2023. And so there's so many things, there's important takeaways outside of what we just covered as well. So thank you all.
Do you think there might be concern that Toronto could be facing ongoing problems because of the austerity cut that is committed by the Coney's government?
That's more complicated than it sounds. Most of the federal funding that we get actually doesn't come directly to the city. It goes to the province, who then pass it along to the city. The best example of this is childcare. There's federal funding for childcare, but it goes to the province of Ontario, and then we get some funding, and so do the not-for-profit operators. The one thing that's really hit us hard from the federal level this year was the elimination of the carbon tax, because that actually provided money that was invested in some of the city's net zero programs. The other big federal piece we get is there is direct funding for affordable housing projects, and the city of Toronto is frankly the leader in the country right now on affordable housing. If the federal government doesn't renew and expand its investments in affordable housing, we would have to pretty much just stop. The province, on the other hand, has hit us high, low, and sideways. They've directly cut certain kinds of investments they used to make in the city. They've legally restricted the city from some of the ways we used to raise revenue. So we have something called development charges, which is a fee we charge anytime someone builds a new housing unit, so that we can get some of the profit from the private housing system back to pay for the infrastructure to support that housing. The provincial government has constrained that really severely, and that's hurting our bottom line. That's the direct. The sideways is they've made some changes like eliminating speed cameras, which we were collecting fine money from and reinvesting into road safety. Because we no longer have those speed cameras, we now have to fund the road safety stuff out of the property tax. And I could go on, but the province has hurt us the most. And we are, I'll be very honest, we are facing some very bad budget years in the next couple of years if the federal and provincial governments continue to cut their own budgets and therefore transfers to municipalities.
So yeah, a lot of people concerned about the police budget. Would like to hear more from the councillor's perspective.
Sure. A few things on the police budget. First, a lot of this year's increase was locked in last year because they had a labor negotiation that the police service board did that caused increases to the rate of pay for each police officer. So we were just locked into that. There was nothing we could do about that. That's a lot of what's shown up. We also have what's called a staffing plan through the police, which is a multi-year thing because it takes a while to train a police officer, and they have to go to a police college and so on and so forth. So some of that was locked in. The other two things to bear in mind, and I'm someone who's argued that the police budget is too large, so keep that in mind. The other two things to know is we don't have the final say on the police budget. The police service board can appeal any municipality's funding of the police to a provincial agency if the police feel that they're not getting enough money to enforce the law. And they have threatened that in the previous 2 years, they have threatened to do that. The final thing, and this isn't just about police, but it's about all of our emergency services. For a variety of reasons, response times across our emergency services got really bad about 3 years ago. People were waiting on 911 for 10 minutes, 15 minutes sometimes. And we have set some goals to get those response times down. One of the things we're doing that we hope will have the most impact is to be more tailored in terms of who responds to what call. So a bunch of that work is happening. So it's not police and ambulance show up to everything together, but that's going to take a couple years to work its way through the system.
I'll just add briefly to the councillor's comments. There is some writing on the fact that in terms of having final say over police budget, in 1999, the city of Guelph tried to reduce their police budget. So their police board submitted a budget. The Guelph Council evaluated it, said, we don't want to pay this much. We're going to recommend a funding cut to the police. The police board voted to appeal that, and it went to arbitration through the federal agency, and the city of Guelph was ordered to increase the budget back up to essentially close to the full amount that had been requested by. So the one time that this has been tested, as far as I know, that's the only time that a board was able to budget, and Ontario City Municipality has refused it. And that time, the city was unsuccessful, and they were ordered to pay it. Yes.
I do have an additional comment. We have a long-term plan here. Some of you may have heard of the crisis response program that we have. So what we're doing there is we're getting, for certain kinds of calls that come into 911, it might be a person in distress. We're saying that's not always something the police have to respond to. Instead, we might have a mental health worker respond. And you may have seen, we've actually proactively started putting people at certain TTC stations who are part of that program. The long term, it's 211. The long term plan is to what we say detask the police so that they don't have some of the tasks they have now, but they only respond to things where the police are appropriate. We're in a transition now where we have to build up the community crisis response, prove its success, hire more people, train more people, and start reducing the number of calls that go to the police by having more and more people know to call 211 instead of 911. So we have a long-term plan to try to reduce our reliance on policing, but we're in this really awkward transition moment right now where we're trying to reduce the wait times on 911, introduce the new service, and get everyone to learn the new number, 211, 211, 211.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.